IVM.
Hello and welcome to Litnama. I'm your host Laxmi Krishnan, and on today's episode, we have with us someone who is the appropriate guest to get on an episode that is recorded on the longest day of the year. Of course, because this person's list of achievements and experiences and things that inspired me as a person would definitely require the longest day of the year. A writer and a translator, as well as a student of literature, which of course are my favorite type of people, he went on to realize the different spaces in the country that really needed an intervention as well as help. And he decided to not wait for another opportunity to come his way and just do it by himself. By writing to the editor of Times of India, asking him to go to Kashmir and report about the stories there when he was just in school, to then founding so many brilliant projects. And now with all the relief work that he's doing in COVID, he is the real example of bridging the gap between theory and practice, and he embodies that belief throughout. Joining me right after this short break is writer, curator, and as well as a great translator who has been the founding force behind the director of Dara Shikoh Fellowship, the curator of Pink List India, and an incoming Rhodes Scholar. Please join me as we welcome Anish Gawande.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hello Anish, welcome to Litnama. This has been such a long time coming because I've been following your work all over the place, and it's been so inspiring to see you do all these amazing things. There are so many congratulations in order first. First of all, like you're doing some amazing relief work even in the middle of a pandemic. It's not easy, and cannot even begin to imagine the amount of difficulties you might be facing on ground. And being listed for GQ comes just in order for that. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And I also heard that you have a poem coming up in an anthology of queer poetry, like South Asian queer poetry. So I'm just really curious. Tell me more about it.
So that is actually the most interesting and exciting project I've worked on. And it's a project I revisited after a really long time because the poem was translated donkeys ages ago, right? And then Miss Rona decided to come and surprise all of us, and the publishing world got thrown into a frenzy. But this is essentially a poetry anthology called The World That Belongs to Us, which has been edited by the always delightful Akhil Katyal and Aditi Angiras, which is going to be released very soon, and you can find it on Amazon, in your nearest bookstore. Please go to a physical bookstore and buy it. They need us more than ever right now. And the poem I've translated there is one that I hold particularly close, which is a poem by Professor Ramchandra Siras, who was the professor at Aligarh Muslim University who was outed and then, trigger warning, eventually died by suicide on 8th April 2010. And his poem is spectacular, right? It's called Paya Khali. The poetry collection is called Paya Khali Hirvar, which I sort of translate as verdin, that sort of undistinguished greenery under my feet. And the poem itself is called Zhopaicha Kholya, which is rooms to sleep in. And I think it's a beautiful, beautiful poem because Siras is, of course, in the closet when he writes this, and there isn't anything explicitly queer about it in the sense of explicit mention of sexuality, but the poem itself and its style and its format is delightfully queer. Not just because of Siras's sexuality alone, but more so actually because of the fact that it transgresses form. It does fun things with literature. So very excited for that. I've gone on a completely different rant, but that is the poem that will be out soon that I'm very
No,
excited for.
it's not completely different because it just I was just like, so I'm obsessed with Marathi poetry, okay, to begin with, firstly.
Oh
And
wow.
I'd heard about Saras's work, but I haven't read it in translation. So I'm super excited to read the anthology when it comes out. And Akhil Katyal is like my go-to recommendation for everybody who wants to, have a go at reading contemporary Indian poetry. I'm like, it's right there. Just look him up on Instagram. It's as simple as that. Um, but again, I'm also a fan of you for multiple reasons. One of them being you're also a student of literature,
Yeah.
comparative literature and society to be specific. And Colombia, I mean, how was the experience? Because I remember reading that you specialized in South Asian and Francophone African literature. So
Yes. So
how did it all like? Did you always know you wanted to study literature?
So, for instance, going in, right, I did not actually know that I wanted to study literature. When I was applying to college and when I entered university, I was your standard issue, good Indian boy, economics and political science student who was dead set on doing something that would land me a job. And that was back when I was a straight boy applying to college. And of course, I came out and realized also along the way that I did not enjoy economics or political science, both of which I have almost completed the coursework for in college as well. And I stumbled upon comparative literature very randomly and fell in love. And I think for me, my academic training as somebody who studied comparative literature is not in literature per se, right? But in a field that
Right.
is a contemporary field that sort of engages with literary theory and applies it to contemporary social and political phenomenon. So I think it's an incredible space to be in because you're reading a lot of literature, but simultaneously you're also reading law, you're reading history, you're reading theory, and you're learning and adapting all of these complex phenomenon into the world as we see it today. And I think that sort of is reflected in the way I approach the relationship between academia and activism and forms of engagement with the world at large. And it's been an incredible journey. And so I did, and very funnily enough, right, at college, I ended up focusing more on the Francophone world. And my thesis is actually on Senegalese linguistic politics. And I ended up spending almost every summer in Paris on grants doing research on French colonialism, race in the French Empire, gender and sexuality in sort of contemporary France, and then spent a lot of time after graduation in Senegal, sort of tidying up my thesis. And I hope that I'll be able to do more of that. So I think going abroad, going to Colombia, getting the opportunity to study under some incredible folks was an eye opening experience because it reminds you that there's so much more to the world. And if this little boy from Bombay could end up studying Francophone West Africa and reach the other end of the world, there is something for all of us to remember that we don't have to be confined by our geographies. And something fun that says that you can explore what you want, you can study what you want, and you can find interest in things that people might say aren't your place to be exploring.
I mean, that's the beauty of literature, right? Because when people hear that somebody is studying literature, in whatever language, if you look at it that way, people think that you're just like waking up, reading books, and going about your day, reading more books, and go to sleep. But if they don't realize that studying literature does not happen in an isolation, Sometimes it's scary for me when literature students say that I love reading as a hobby because I strongly believe that any literature student who actually studies literature grows on to looking like having this very, like a complex relationship with books and with literature in itself because you don't only look at it as a book you would like to read on a nice rainy evening, but you look at it as something like a place from where you make sense of the world around you. Something that kind of guides how you look at things and you make sense of them and you're like, okay, this is how a thing is supposed to be, which is not sometimes your personal history. And what you just said totally resonates with me on that, because I need more and more people to understand that literature studies do not happen in like this unilateral way where you do literary criticism, but it kind of pushes you to do a lot more things. And I feel in your case that is also kind of translated into other work, other brilliant work that you've been doing apart from be it translation or your most recent projects where you took popular Prakashan's work and you went to Sakshi and you put up a show. And Katarvel is such a beautiful name. Like, I'm
That
just
was,
heart-eyes.
yeah. So Katarvel is such an incredible word that's almost untranslatable, right? Because it's the time where day scissors into night. And it's got this beautiful evocation of nostalgia. It's got this link to popular itself because Kavi Grace, who's a renowned Marathi poet, was called the poet of
Yeah.
Katarvel, and his first book was published by Popular, and the sort of art camps organized by Popular stopped around 2010, 2012 and remain but a distant memory for so many artists who participated in them. And so putting together a show with the art collection of one of Bombay's oldest and most important publishers, and a trilingual publisher at that, right? Popular did work primarily in Marathi and English, but also in Hindi, was a tribute to the city and a tribute to the multilingual heritages that we carry with all of us. And the sort of delightfulness in enjoying something that has linguistic textures. And so it was I like to call it a bookshelf with an exhibition attached, because the hallmark of the exhibition for me was a collection of over 100 out of print works from Popular Prakashan's collections, from works by the Dalit Panthers to JP's Prison Diaries to the Marathi Riyasat series to some incredible other stuff that dealt with a lot of contemporary issues that we face today. And the show sort of gets built around it. And you have all the most incredible names in the Indian art world all coming together on these eccentric camps to everywhere from Egypt to Morocco, and creating works long before the Indian art market boomed, and being displayed by this scrawny 23-year-old who really didn't know what he was doing. So I knew what I was doing with the bookshelf. With the artwork, it was my debut show, right? So I had fun with it. But I don't know how it turned out. People seem to like it, or so they tell me.
Okay then, because I have not stopped hearing about it from my friends and people I work with at Culture Lab, and they just kept raving about the show and talking about how we missed an opportunity, because that was the time when most of us were finishing up our exams and internals, so we couldn't come to the show. And everyone at Culture Lab was like, "Oh, never mind, it's going to be on for a few more days. We're going to take you there." And then the lockdown happened, so we just all kind of live in this aftermath of regret of missing a really good show. And I kept reading about Popular Prakashan because I remember, like, one of my most distinct childhood memories was going to this one aunt of mine who was obsessed with reading, right? So she had a membership at a government library, and she used to bring home these most random books, but they used to have such beautiful covers. And some of the most beautiful covers and stories that I have read growing up, which were 100% not meant for my age group, were by Popular Prakashan. So it's a major hit of nostalgia.
But I wonder actually, this reminds me that it seems so long ago that this lockdown began to begin with. And this sudden sort of shuttering of the exhibition and its abandonment of sorts, and it's still lying there in the gallery, hung just like it was before, reminds me that, for me, the exhibition was also the creation of a space where people could come in and read and could sit there, have a cup of chai. I used to be there almost every day and explore the work, be with the art, but with the books as well. And in many ways, that is the process of reading as well. I think after the lockdown has begun, and partly because of relief work and partly because of a host of other reasons, I found it almost impossible to read. You know, when
Yeah.
in reality one would assume that everything's shut, there's nothing else to do. So obviously, the thing that will be most accessible is reading. But in many ways, because reading is such a emotional process, almost it's such an invested process. Being able to read when the world is going to the dogs or at a time of such immense uncertainty seems almost impossible. And that sort of stableness that is needed to pick up a book and read it just hasn't come about. So I get it completely when you say that, people expect those studying literature or those who love books to just pick up a book and enjoy it almost as if you would a Netflix documentary. But
Yeah.
it's more nuanced than that.
I guess this complexity also comes from the fact that we are so attached to reading as a process,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, like I said, as emotional upheaval that happens when you start reading a narrative that you feel, sometimes you categorize books as comfort books that you can keep going back to, because I feel like you feel very emotionally stable about those books,
Yeah.
that you know that it's going to be hurt on this page, and I'm going to get hurt, but I'm going to get over it by page 3.
Yeah.
But when you pick up a new book and you do not know what's coming at you through it, it's just even more like nerve wracking to kind of keep going. Which is why, like, in the pandemic, I tried reading too, like on a spree, and I thought, oh, I'm going to buy all these books and I'm going to read as much as possible. I just ended up going back to the books I own and like kind of organizing them over and over until I could narrow it down to that one book I really want to read. I
Really?
guess that really helped.
Yeah, I've been reading. Can you believe it? I'm just looking at my bookshelf right now. Only the last book I read is James Herriot. All things, all creatures great and small. About this vet in the middle of Yorkshire, in the middle of rural Yorkshire, because it's the only thing that allows me to take my mind off all the madness going on around us. And I'm like, for a lot of people who would be thinking, oh, what is Anish reading? And everyone who presumes that people who love reading are reading like very serious stuff all the time. I'm reading the most inane kids book that I probably read for the first time when I was 8. But it's beautiful
Oh my
and I'm
god.
having so much fun reading it.
I have not even, okay, this is going to be like a public admission. I went back to reading Hannah Montana books that I had stocked up when I was a kid. And like, I have so many margin notes. I don't know for what reason, but there are
Wow.
notes in my book. I have been just going through like looking at the amount of growth that happens, right? Because, like you said, like reading in itself for you has been difficult, but also like you are someone I know who does not live only in an academic space. You also do a lot of grassroots level work. You have done like your work with Pinterest, for example, sets a major example for people to kind of see how different disciplines come together to form an idea or like an ideology in itself. Or you work with the fellowship. So, like when you looked at Dara Shikoh Fellowship, did you like think about it just like you thought about popular Prakashan, or what was your journey with that?
The Dara Shikoh Fellowship is a complicated creature. It came about very randomly. I had started going to Kashmir actually when I was in school because I was working with the Times of India student edition at the time. And I had read Mirza Wahid's Collaborator, which is a phenomenal book that everybody listening and you too should pick up and read because it's powerful beyond measure, right? And Mirza Wahid writes on Kashmir and sort of the turbulent period of the 90s. And for me, reading that as a kid growing up in Bombay who had only consumed mainstream media came as a rude awakening because I thought of myself as well read, and suddenly I realized that what the sort of mainstream Indian media was telling me about Kashmir was hogwash. And it left me incredibly disturbed for a very long time. And this is where I think the reason a lot of literature bleeds into activism for me is that books leave me with a lot of emotional baggage almost that needs to be processed after I finish reading. But reading the Collaborator sort of pushed me towards saying I want to go to Kashmir and I want to see what students my age think about things around me, right? And I went to my editor at the Times of India and I said, I want to go and I want to get young Kashmiri students to write for Times of India student edition. She looked at me and laughed and said, haha, get the permissions and sure, sure. Almost certain that there was no chance that I would be going to Kashmir and sort of starting off a project like this. But that evening, I wrote to Omar Abdullah, to the governor, N.N. Bora, who's since become a very good friend, and to the Directorate of Education, School Education in J&K, and they all replied. And they said, come to Srinagar. So with these 3 letters, I went to my editor at the Times of India and I said, now give me a press pass. And she was completely stunned because she's like, what has this kid done? Like, how the hell has he gotten?
This is so characteristic of you.
But it's so random, because I did not know any of them. I know nobody in Kashmir. Like, I had never been to Kashmir before in my life. I was like completely unrelated to any of these people. And I wrote them a genuine random email and sent it to the ID that I found on the website. And I was like, chalo, it's out in the void. If it works, it works. It doesn't work, it doesn't work. And that's sort of been my process all my life. I'm like, take a chance. Like, what's the harm? And sometimes things happen, sometimes they don't. But you take your chances, right? So I started working in Kashmir then, which was incredible. But I went there and I realized the situation was far worse than I could have possibly imagined sitting in Bombay. And what Kashmiri students wanted to write, the Times of India didn't want to publish. And what the Times of India wanted to publish, which is what they think on Harry Potter, Kashmiri students didn't want to write. Because there were stories of how their grandparents had lost vision because of tear gas shells and canisters that had been thrown into their houses in the old part of the city. There were stories worse than this as well, and these were stories that were waiting to be told. And I realized that this simply wasn't the right platform to do it. But lo and behold, I'd made too many friends in Kashmir not to care about the region anymore. And I went back the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. And on one of those trips, I met Dr. Jyoti Singh, who is incredible, who used to run something called the Almond Villa in Srinagar. And she used to run the Dara Shikoh Festival, which was this annual cultural festival that happened in Srinagar, where people from all sorts of different places around the world came together for this incredible cultural safe space, right? And I said, I love the festival. Let's start a fellowship with it. And at that time, we called it the Scholars Program. And we started off with a budget of like less than 1 lakh. And we said, chalo now, like, Ghar is here, Kashmir is here, let's do something crazy. And so the first fellowship, the Scholars Program, was held through a Word doc that I had designed with some random template I found on the internet. It had no website. It had one random email ID that I had created. And the response was overwhelming. And we got so many applications from everywhere, from Egypt to the US to India to so many places, right? And we said we've clearly touched a nerve here. And that's when the fellowship was born, to explore art and culture through interdisciplinary ways in cross-cultural collaborative engagements. And this was before, this is the funny thing, this was before fellowship became a very big thing. Like, after that is when the Young India Fellowship started, and a lot of new fellowships started coming about. When we started the Dara Shikoh Fellowship, it was a complete random experiment. It was 4 people ending up in J&K together and having fun. And honestly, it remains the most eccentric, quirky, crazy fellowship on this planet because, one, you're working in Kashmir, so you never know what's going to change when. The first time we had the fellowship, Burhan Wani was killed 7 days before we were supposed to start. Things fell apart. 2 of our fellows couldn't fly into India. The 2 that we had, one from Chicago, one from Baroda, were made to sort of do the fellowship between Delhi, Bombay, and Jammu. And we sort of just, what is that word I'm looking for? We winged it. So, we just winged it. And that's how it's been so long. We had the fellowship last year in the middle of the lockdown when, after the abrogation of Article 370, the Indian government imposed the absolutely brutal and inhuman communications blackout and sort of transport blackout. And we still had it in Bhadarwa. So we've sort of had fun with the fellowship, and it's grown into a space that feels like home almost, and feels more also
Yeah.
like a low stakes, experimental, collaborative space for enthusiasm. Sorry, I don't know about
That
that.
is so essential for even like how we imagine growth in the arts, or how we gauge development is so weird, because we think of it as like this vertical scale that keeps going higher and the stakes keep rising. But we need to also realize that art actually grows like in a very horizontal sense, when it kind of embraces bigger spaces and brings more people towards it, brings more people towards an experience from where they can grow as people. And that is how you can think of a development of a culture in itself. And this feeling is something I feel like you completely embody, because you're not someone like, often criticism comes towards academia from a space where they're like, oh, but you people who study literature, art, culture, society always talk about highbrow things in like MUN-ish spaces. But then I asked them to look at you. And I mean, we have both done our fair share of MUNs, but you also been someone who is always ready to kind of, roll up your sleeves and be like, okay, what needs to be done? Let's do it. And I've seen that again with your work with the fellowship. I've seen that also with your work with Inklist, because it came around in a time that was supremely important, right? And it was supremely important to know stands for people, like who, like in times where people have to take a stand, who is actually ready to take a stand and speak for a large group of people who demand to be heard and who listens, which becomes very essential. And recently, the State of Union was also super interesting. So
Yeah.
when Pinklist came around, you kind of, I feel like it came from this intersection between the queer movement in the country, which was on a rise and like getting stronger and stronger every single day, and also the political movement, which sort of kind of was pushing itself into this turmoil where you didn't know what's going to be the verdict out of this particular situation. So standing on those intersections, how did Pinklist, like, what was your biggest fear, if there was any, with starting Pinklist to begin with?
Arey, what was my biggest fear? All my fears. I was working in Kashmir. Can you imagine coming out? For the longest time, I'd kept my queer work and my queer life in separate buckets, and my work in Kashmir in separate buckets. I was terrified of coming out, because I was afraid
Yeah.
of what that would mean for my work in Kashmir. I was afraid of what that would mean for the Dara Shikoh Fellowship. I was afraid of what that would mean for my ability to go back to Srinagar, because the way the pink list sort of blew up, it made headlines across the place, right? And I remember very
Yeah.
distinctly that one of the first few pieces that came out was an interview I did with the Times of India that I'd done very randomly and sent off when the journalist had asked me to. And I didn't know much about when it was going to be published, because we were already so busy with one, the pink list work, and two, I was still running an election campaign. So I was working 18-hour days amidst all of this. And one day, very randomly, on a Sunday, on the opinion section of the Times of India, right next to Shobha Day's article, was this massive interview of Anish Gawande with a big photo of me in my Columbia graduation robes. And that was it. It was national edition. It was printed everywhere. And being the late riser that I am, I woke up at 1 p.m. on Sunday to a barrage of phone calls, Instagram posts, Twitter DMs, all sorts of things, because everyone and their mother had seen it. And I was like, oh, I guess I've come out now. And
Oh God.
so the pink list, I think that was the scary bit, right? It was, how do you let these two worlds collide?
Hmm.
But when they did collide, something magical happened, right? I think the reaction from folks in Kashmir was far more positive than I could have imagined it to be. Later on, last year in August, after again the abrogation of 370, I wrote an incredibly important piece, I feel, on For Queers in Kashmir, There Is No Gay Liberation,
Yeah.
which called out the propaganda of the government that said that removal of Article 370 was the removal of Section 377, and this move was actually made to benefit LGBTQIA plus rights in Kashmir. And that was to me a moment where I said that my work in Kashmir and my work on queerness need to speak to each other. And I said that this is hogwash. You have imposed an inhuman communications blackout, which means no phone or no internet access in the entire region and no freedom of movement. You have systematically denied spaces to queer people in the region and then call yourself queer friendly. You're pinkwashing and covering up your deeds with a lie, because removing Article 370 did not remove Section 377. Section 377 fell in Jammu and Kashmir the same time it fell in Delhi or Bombay on 6 September 2018, almost a year before the move to remove Article 370. And writing that article and continuing the engagement at the intersection of queerness and Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh has actually resulted in some beautiful conversations, right? Where a lot of folks who work in Kashmir have said that they hadn't really thought of queer rights before, and a lot of people working on queer rights have said that they haven't and hadn't thought of Kashmir before. And you saw Kashmiris coming for Delhi Pride, and you saw sort of queer folks holding up placards for Kashmir during the CA and RC protests, and something beautiful and magical happened. And I think these are the solidarities and conversations that came about when the fear of having these two worlds collide into each other didn't exist anymore. And I thank Shobha Day for that, because without her, nobody would have read my article.
That is such a bizarre turn of events. Because, wow. And it's kind of like sometimes when I also think of things when I'm having these conversations with people who inspire me, I sometimes really wonder, and I mince my words a lot, but I am very sure that whatever words I use to pose a question need to be the most appropriate words that I could use. And in this case, when I use the word fear, I realize that we should be in this, like, looking at India right now, it seems very utopian. But I still feel like somewhere we should be in a place where our first fear, like before starting anything, we should not be afraid of the consequence already. But very clearly, whatever activist turns have happened in the country after a significant amount of time of a government have always been, kind of eclipsed by this fear of, oh, what if, or what will happen if this thing goes this way. And that's why when I looked at Pinterest, I realized that you were taking some really big, risks to also kind of identify so many people, do the groundwork in times where information about people in power is often kind of jeopardized.
And systematically denied.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I'm going to butt in here because I think you raise an important point, because, it's often that academia bleeds into activism in this way, because you realize through literatures that you've read from across the world of the Chilean Revolution, or what happened in Haiti, or what happened in South Africa under the apartheid regime, that the sort of the state, the dictatorial state, relies on obfuscation of information to carry out its agenda. It relies on the systematic denial of information to ensure that people are not aware of the ways in which they are being manipulated. And that is why sort of, Pinkless India comes off as like this cute little pink fun space, but the work that is powerful for me is the fact that it provides information that is being institutionally suppressed.
Often obfuscated.
Yeah. It's being hidden from us purposely,
Yeah, I think the word institutional here becomes very important, right? Because you're almost trained to never ask these questions. You're almost kind of, if you are a regular student in a regular academic institution, you are told that you have certain rights, but you're never told how you're supposed to exercise them. Like, I can stand in front of my local body authorities and question because it is my right to do so. And in times like these, it becomes very important to see how your government reacts to these intersections of power that have already existed. Like, queer people are not, like, surprisingly, I have this discussion with a lot of people around me that when you think of queer literature, you often think of what is happening in the West. You're often thinking about who from the West is writing the most perfect queer narrative ever. Like, yes, I'm all for reading Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe, but also have you heard of Nirala? Have you heard of Nirala writing The Life Misspent or Kullipat, where he talks about his own bisexuality? It's Machukai, exactly. I mean, the goddess of it all. And I just don't realize how people choose to kind of not read into these symbols of very, very obvious queer political representations and choose to kind of look at it in a very Western angle. Like people say, oh, queer is a Western notion, but it has always been around, it has always existed. And what does it mean for someone in power to look at, this systematic oppression of queer people that has happened for so many years under a very, very almost demonic article, and then from there to look and support a cause, which is why I feel Pinklist does a very, very essential job.
Thank you very much. What you said today is very interesting because we often assume that queer literature means literature written by queer people, right? But I think there's literature that is delightfully queer in its ability to transgress boundaries, right? I think, again, Siras's example is important here because Siras's sexuality makes his literature queer in one sense, but his ability to transgress the dominant canon of Marathi literature is what I think queers his literature more. And there's also literature that we must read as queer that often gets, again, obfuscated in larger narratives. And there's a beautiful piece that I read actually just today because it is Father's Day by Anjali Arondekar, who writes about her father, who comes from an incredibly anti-caste activist background. And Anjali writes about how her father, after she came out to him, said that, what are you going to do for your community? And how are you going to uplift your community? And in doing that, he said, all the gays need to read Ambedkar, a position that he stuck to for the rest of his life. And reading Ambedkar is an important queer experience because we have to remember that, one, as a queer person in India, the right that we have as queer people are those that have been given to us by Ambedkar. We have to also remember that it is an Ambedkarite movement that has been systematically standing up for queerness, right from Ambedkar standing up and defending the editor of a newspaper back in the 1930s who'd carried a letter from a gay man who had said that I'm confused about my sexuality and responded saying that it's okay and got filed with a defamation suit for public indecency. And this is a story narrated by Disha Pinky Sheikh, of course, the incredible Dalit Ambedkarite trans woman activist who's the first trans spokesperson of a political party in Maharashtra. And the story involves Ambedkar standing up for this editor and saying that you have the freedom to say that being gay is okay. And at a time when nobody stood up for this man, it was Ambedkar who stood up because of the firm belief in the values of equality. And later on in the 1980s, before the NGOization of the sort of queer movement in India, you see an incredible move by Namdev Dhasal, one of the Dalit Panthers, in Maharashtra again, where Dhasal leads a morcha of trans people and sex workers to demand ration cards. So, queer literature involves reading Dhasal, queer literature involves reading Ambedkar, queer literature involves reading someone like Jyotiba Phule, or does involve reading someone like Chokha Meya, because this is a sort of narrative of breaking against societally ordained boundaries that is deliciously queer.
And since you mentioned Chokha Meya, I would also like to recommend people to read more female bhakti poets. Absolutely. Like a Kanu Patra or a Janabai, because honestly, my understanding of feminism changed completely when I read these women. When I read like a Baby Haldar, and I kind of tried to understand how the world around her, how did she make sense of the world around her. And recently, in the pandemic, I've been enjoying this one book really slowly because I really want to cherish it. It's, oh my god, it's by Vandana Mishra and Me Mithachi Bhauli.
Oh wow.
And it's translated by Jerry Pinto.
Oh wow.
It's a beautiful book.
After that, you must read Urmila Pawar.
I have read her work in bits and pieces, but I want to right now I've also been looking forward to read more of Salma's poetry, Rajati Salma's poetry. So I've just lined up a lot of powerful female voices, and it's just crazy. Which also makes me realize that we are way beyond our usual time for taking a break because we clearly lost track of time. So we're just gonna go for a quick break, and right after, I'm going to ask you a little more, like questions that push the boundary a little more and are kind of disturbing in weird sense. See you right after the break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. We appreciate their support. It's been a fantastic week on the IVM network. I hope that you've been checking stuff out, but some of the highlights that you definitely should check out. Ashish Vidyarthi, host of Begin the Journey, was on Cyrus Says. They had a really fun conversation. I think you'll enjoy that. Uncle Please Sid did an episode around development, which was really, really fun. On Edges and Sledges, we had Adam Holyoke, former England captain. While those guys are killing it, one cricketer after the other. Definitely do check out Advertising is Dead. We talk about esports with some really guys who really know that space. Smile India, absolutely right. These guys are killing it as well. So is Pawan at Pragati. Don't forget the Original Things. Again, one of my favorite shows. You must check that out. It's just been a really fun week, folks. So I hope that you enjoy it. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Welcome back after a rather really short break. And Anish and I have not stopped talking, of course. So there are so many things, right? So far we've been speaking about all the amazing projects. I'm not going to say all because these are only some. And I know that you're going to do so many amazing things in the coming time. But kind of like this is a dilemma that I've often found myself in. That whenever like I stand up for an opinion or I stand up for a position, a political position, mine or someone else's, the general counter argument to that has often come from people saying, "Oh, you humanities students read theories and you apply it everywhere, but you don't have any idea about lived experiences." Surprisingly for me, it has been the other way around, that I have gained more exposure to lived experiences when I started reading a lot of narratives in translation. I remember reading Baluta the first time, and I remember that experience. I still remember that line that the character says that they were wearing their past consciousness like a coat that they would leave on the peg while walking inside. And I realized like it makes a lot of sense for so many people I know. And like we have this inner world and outer world, like you said, that you categorize your work in buckets where you were initially scared that how if and how they overlap, how are they going to affect each other? So from that space, I kind of wanted to ask you like a very rather disturbing question for me, that does your education, does your experience and exposure on the academic space assist how you look at the grassroots, or does it go the other way around? What is the strained relationship that you think they share?
I think it's a tangled mess, right? Because in many ways, I've learned more in the 2 years since I've come back from college and met so many people and been involved in everything from electoral politics and traveling around Maharashtra as a proud gay man and sort of engaging with a lot of Ambedkarite activists and Ambedkarite theory than I have in the 4 years that I spent at university. And in many other ways, I've been able to develop, to critically examine, and to make sense of the world in more interesting ways because of the education that I've had, right? So they bleed into each other. And I think this is something I've always believed in, even with the Dara Shikoh Fellowship, which is unique because it's the only fellowship where you're not required to finish anything by the end of the fellowship. It's a month-long fellowship. At the end of the fellowship, you're expected to have nothing ready. So it's the 5th year of the fellowship this year, and my first fellow has still not submitted her work, but it's being created and is phenomenal, and I can't wait. And maybe it'll take 10 years for it to grow and become the work that it's meant to be, right? But in the same way, I think one must look at education, one must look at experiences as things that germinate, that they wrap themselves around your mind and they sort of influence your daily actions, the projects you undertake, the way you imagine the work you do in strange, unusual, insidious, incredibly personal ways. And I think that's what's beautiful. And I think having the opportunity to explore and examine things through an academic lens reading about race, reading about caste, reading about gender, reading about sexuality, and then having the chance to work in spaces that remain deeply challenging, remain deeply casteist, misogynist, homophobic, transphobic, has been an important part, right? And I think someone who puts it brilliantly is, although she's also problematic, but someone I've learned a lot from, and I think she's ridiculously intelligent, is Gayatri Spivak, right?
I kind of saw the name coming around the corner
Yeah,
the moment you
so it
said
was very
little
funny because
problematic but bad.
my last year of college is when I take a class with her, and she's the most terrifying human being I've met in my life. And she's probably the most terrifying human being most people have met in their lives, because she's phenomenally intelligent and phenomenally articulate and razor sharp with her rebuttals and her arguments, and her justification that I am an activist and an academic and you can't hyphenate the two or separate them was what spoke to me most. That our work in reading about the unlearning of oppression is in itself an act of unlearning, and it reflects in many ways in what we do. And so I think that there's no easy answer to this. Your academic training sort of gets tattooed onto your body and then seeps into your veins, and then suddenly many years later will manifest in some odd way or another.
Yeah. I guess that's how everyone's experience with Foucault goes to begin
Oh,
with.
Bhakti.
But that being said, the moment you said Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, another question just zoomed past my mind. I remember, so Mumbai University does not prescribe theory for you to study as an undergraduate student, right? So it's an optional way that your professors might use to kind of familiarize you with concepts. But I remember reading Candace Subaltern speak as a first year MA student. And I also remember crying because it was so difficult to decipher in the first go. And I mean, I'm not ashamed to say that till date.
So don't worry, you're not
Sorry.
alone. Most people misinterpret that text, and it drives even Spivak up a wall, and she's spoken about it multiple times. But
Yeah, I mean, I realize I'm not alone because this was like a recommended text for our external examinations. So not only were we supposed to usually if it's an assignment, you can find a way to understand it and then write something. We were supposed to study this text and write a paper, like an examination upon it. And it was so scary because I used to jumble up the concepts and the words. And for me, it became too technical a language for someone who's not primed to read a certain academic train of thought. Like, for example, that was my experience with Derrida, and a lot of people experience that with Derrida, where you cannot really decipher what Derrida means to say, and some people lead their entire lives being confused between signs and signification, which is a very complicated experience, because then if you go on to read more structural and post-structural theory, you realize you need to have your bases right. But do you feel like, as like you said before, like a boy from Bombay who went to Columbia to learn, do you feel academic language sometimes becomes very exclusionary in itself, in its own practice? Have you ended up in this place where you do want to understand, you do want to learn things a certain way, but the language becomes a barrier?
so, I don't have the usual hot take on this, which is yes. I see this thrown around a lot on Twitter, like, oh, academics should write more easy stuff, etc., etc.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't agree, honestly. And I think that for me, there is a difference between academics and interlocutors, right? And it's the same difference that you observe in any discipline, right? I don't expect to understand what quantum mechanics is without knowing the basics of physics. I don't expect anybody working on sort of complex mathematical theorems to make them understandable to me if I don't know my basic calculus. And in the same way, one cannot expect the humanities also to be simplified, because the arguments build upon each other, right? It is a pyramid, right? Every argument is built on the backs of so many other arguments that have been made before. And it increases in complexity because it is delving into a deeper and deeper understanding of a particular subject, and it doesn't necessarily translate into practical realities immediately. Same example with physics, right? Quantum mechanics doesn't have real life practical applications yet, right? But it still is a theoretical avenue that is being explored extensively and theoretically. And in the same way, academia is being explored theoretically and pushed in certain ways theoretically. Now, there are interlocutors who can make that applicable to what is happening with the world today. There are interlocutors who can take that theory and sort of see how it applies to what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Kashmir, what's happening in Somalia, what's happening in other parts of the world, what's happening with a range of social phenomena. But the fundamental problem is not with the academics. The fundamental problem is with how the humanities are taught, right? Like you said, you had no theory at the undergraduate level, and you were suddenly asked to read Spivak for your first year MA. You would never be expected to do this in the sciences, right? Would anybody give you calculus before teaching you addition and subtraction? No. So how is it assumed that till sort of even, I would say, even until the 12th standard, we treat the social sciences and the humanities as things and spaces where you have to mug up large chunks of text, whereas we see math or the natural sciences as being involved in a certain set of logics that need to be understood. Like, why did I have to spend so much time understanding organic chemistry when I was not told about literary theory, apart from what is a simile and what is a metaphor?
This is just like my autobiography playing like out in front of my eyes right now, because I remember like this is also exactly what like Twitter has a lot of academic arguments going out and around, and this is exactly what is happening with Angela Davis and Marx, right? Because everyone's saying, oh, you should not read Marx, you should read race theorists, but race theorists themselves are saying, hey, read Marx and then come and read us, because only then it would make sense for you to look from the angle that we kind of look at the world. Like, as much as I suffered trying to understand where Spivak comes from, when I had a good professor tell me the premise of her argument, things became more clear, because from a post-colonial position that she was kind of trying to make sense of the world from, it made complete sense for her to use a certain language, a certain methodology to kind of unpack theory. But that being said, like, since you work with so many different disciplines, do you also sometimes feel like the argument that you just brought up, that literary theory needs to be taught? Something that is very on the lines of Pink List is also how civics is taught in schools.
Oh, 100%.
Most of the
like we don't know our representatives. We're not told about what our corporator does or what our MLA does and what our MP does. And that's a major problem, because most of us end up not knowing who we're voting for or what the importance of that vote is. So civic consciousness most certainly is important. Understanding what vote is important, where is important. And that battle is a long, long one to fight.
I mean, in times where chapters from mandated history are being taken out.
Yeah.
So let alone think about the history that never made it to the books to begin with.
Exactly.
It's just so scary, because this is another argument that my professor keeps having with us, that if you're talking about India, you need to talk about Indian theory, you need to talk about certain structural or functional ideas from Indian theory. But you know what? Sometimes I feel like if I feel what, say, an Angela Davis is saying about prisons makes total sense when I look at how the Indian prison systems work, and especially when I read it parallel to a Manoranjan Bepari's work about how he wrote from the prisons themselves. If I feel like that makes sense, then let it make sense.
Yeah.
This need to bracket everything and label and categorize everything is so rampant in academia that they don't realize that the fact that alienates people from humanities is not the theory or the language, but it's these labels and categories that you're so, kind of flustered to pack things in. Because I don't remember a single day in my literature class where I didn't speak about psychology, sociology, history, or even mathematics for that sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to get this increasingly poignant from here, but since you have like with roads on your way now and you're looking like at a larger picture, do you feel that there are certain basics of how people perceive humanities or how people perceive studying the arts needs to kind of alter? Like, what are a few things that if you are given a power to change or develop that you would do?
Bapri, this is a very tricky question. What am I? I am but a drop in the ocean. But, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what I would change because I don't think I've been able to pinpoint exactly what goes wrong in the teaching of the humanities. I feel like for me right now, I would want every single person in the humanities to learn about the digital humanities and sort of get more engaged with cartography, with map making, with data visualization, with using tech to work through the humanities, to see the potentials of the internet and technology to engage with both theory and praxis because I think it's a space that has been neglected by the humanities for so long as being not related to the work being done by the humanities, and so has been overtaken by the natural sciences and by other disciplines and by commerce in particular. And the emancipatory potential of the internet, and Paromita Vora writes beautifully about this, and Agents of Ishq, I think, is a beautiful example of how this is done. The negation of the emancipatory potential of the internet and our sort of lack of engagement with the possibilities that it opens up is a shame because something like Pinkless comes out of that. It is an engagement of the humanities with technology. State of the Union is an interactive map where you can type in your address and see what your MP has said on LGBTQIA plus rights. It's the simplest way to transform civic accountability. Because for so long, the argument of a lot of people is, I don't know who my MP is. If I have to find out who my MP is, by the way, it's a task and then some. It's very hard.
Yeah.
But with the internet, I've made it as easy as typing your address onto a Google Maps format and getting the name of your MP and what they've said on LGBTQIA plus rights. So how do we engage with technology and how do we use it as a transformative tool is something that I'm intrigued by and interested in.
That's, like if we were recording in a studio right now, I would have just gotten up and given you a hug at this point because I have been screaming about how you need to, like, even when I started this podcast, initially my idea was that I want to start a podcast, but and I made my first pitch and I told people at IBM that, I don't want to do a very traditional literature approach where I talk to people who are, involved in the literary space. Like, I don't want to do like an exclusive round of authors and poets and editors, but I also want to figure out how, internet has kind of changed how you define literature in itself. Like, how would you define a society has been kind of it's the borders, the boundaries that we understand in the physical space are so different when it's on the internet, when it is in this space that you think is not tangible, but actually shapes how you look at the world and how your life is defined. And in times where like Facebook, Amazon, everyone has all of our data, it's going to be really stupid if you look at literature in isolation as something that is, in print or in digital format of like a fixed definition of a book. What we are doing right now is also literature, and internet makes so many things possible, and it's time people look at everything around as literature. And I'm just so grateful for you to bring it up. It's been a wonderful 1 hour of conversation, Anish. Like, I cannot even, like, with you, honestly, I have told the producers that we need to do like multiple episodes because one is never going to be enough. We're going to have you.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, I believe that you are going to lead some.
I've done like 4 podcasts so far, and I am the most traditional human being on this planet because I do not own earphones. I had to procure them specially for this one because in the event that we might have needed to use them. So I have never ended up listening to podcasts at all because I am the sort of person who has like one Bluetooth speaker sitting on a shelf, and like the only thing I will listen to and the only music I will listen to is at like 11 o'clock at night very nicely. Some Iqbal Bano, some Ali Sethi, and sort of Dashti Tanhai playing, or sort of Chan Kitha playing. And so this podcasting is very intriguing to me because I've been on some of these, but I've never even heard a single one that I have been on. One, because I don't like listening to my own voice. Two, because I don't have earphones. So I'm very intrigued by
Yeah.
how the podcast has become a new medium of communication, and it is a specific type of form.
Yeah. Anish, you've been an absolute delight to speak to, not just because, we have so much in common, but I just love the curiosity that you have looking at things around you and how you are always ready and always prompt. Like I've never ever seen you being reluctant about what you think and what you speak. And that's a quality that is supremely essential in times like these. We need more people to stand up for what they kind of stand on and build up more and more opportunities. So it's been a wonderful time, and I really, really hope we should physically have a great conversation. I am a huge fan of Ali Sethi and Iqbal Bano, so that Bluetooth
Fabulous. We
speaker
will
on the
have a
shelf just
mehfil. I have had this long-standing dream of having a barsati in Delhi and having a mehfil on the terrace with Ali Sethi and Iqbal Bano playing. So, ek din, once we are out of pandemic
yeah,
season.
yeah, zarur ek din. But until that ek din comes, I believe you have a piece that you're going to read for us, and I would really like to get that.
Oof, this is something I've never read before. So, on Litnama, for the first time ever, is poetry by
Let's just
Anish.
see.
Oh dear. I'm hoping nobody makes it till this minute in the podcast. I'm hoping that nobody stays till the end of this podcast and people have already dropped out by now because now I am getting very nervous about reading this poem. This is a poem that was written actually in Bhadarwa last year over the course of the Dara Shikoh Fellowship. And it's a poem that I've never read before. Usually, with all the other works that I do, there's always a bunch of incredible folks reading. Ranjit Hoskote is the one who's read my translation and been such an invaluable help in that. But this is the first poem I've written in a very long time, and it feels strange to revisit it, but here goes. It's called Concertina, which is barbed wire. Concertina grows on the streets of Bhadarwa, outside schools and inside government offices. At times trimmed neatly like a hedge, at times running amok, scattered like a wild shrub. 3 dogs use it as a plate of thorns, nicks and bruises worth the one piece of spoilt mutton. The official government organized a drive to remove concertina, like eucalyptus weed in the last decade. They wanted to remove all signs R stop, A stop, S stop of its violent invasion and their role in its facilitation. But it has grown back quicker, fiercer, and more potent than ever before. Now they call it an endangered species, and Bhadarwa is entrusted with its protection. This is the poem responding to
This was
all the barbed
so
wire that
beautiful.
sprung up after the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, and particularly in Bhadarwa. It's a quaint little town in between Srinagar and Jammu in the Chenab Valley.
Anish, you just like, I'm just going to stop being amused after one point. No, I'm not going to be ever like not amused by all the amazing things that you do. And we need to read more of your poetry. So I'm just waiting for the book to be out so that I can get that beautiful anthology and for you to publish more of your works. But until then, where can we find you on the internet? How can the listeners follow you?
You can find me at Anish Gawande on Instagram and on Twitter, ANISHGAWANDE. You can also follow the work that we do over at Pinklist India, PINKLISTINDIA, and at pinklistindia.com. There's also a website that I have somewhere with all the stuff that I've written. You can search anishkawande.journoportfolio, JOURNOPORTFOLIO.com, and you should be able to see some of the pieces I've written and the work I've put out there as well. But it's been fantastic talking to you, and Litnama has been one of the most fun podcasts that I have been on. So thank you very much, Lakshmi.
Thank you so much. And just like the factor that I was going to give you before, we generally write in the description if our artist is performing or reading something because we believe that people need to listen to this more. So yeah, people are going to stay till the end of the conversation.
Oof, chalo. People are going to stay till the end of the conversation. I'm going to go hide under a rock till this is released.
But I can't wait to meet you in person really soon after all of this is over. And maybe if the exhibition is still on at Sakshi, we'll meet there. And I just can't wait for all the amazing things that you're going to come up with. And I hope to have you back on Litama soon. Thank you for doing this conversation.
And I'm Mehfil in New Delhi.
Most definitely. Bye, take care.
Bye-bye, take care.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
We are from the Open Library Project and we host a podcast called Paperback.
Paperback is a podcast where we engage with stalwarts and experts from various industries, suggesting non-fiction titles that contributed to their journey in a big way.
We've had guests like Anjali Raina, Dr. Marcus Rani, Dr. Swati Lodha, Ambi Parmeswaran, Apurva Damani, and many more on our show Paperback. Find new episodes every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Do you have a night routine? Well, everyone has one. And the to-do list usually looks like this. Brush your teeth, set that alarm, get into your pajamas, and switch off those screens. But here's one more to add to that list. Tune into the Positively Unlimited podcast for a dose of positive action and tips on how to build powerful mindsets. Episodes out every Monday on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you tune into podcasts.